Hey everyone, welcome back to our show. Today I have my friend Eleanor Beaton here with us and loving the big hoops, by the way. I'm such an earring gal, so I always notice when people have cool accessories on. Thank you for being here, Eleanor.
It's so awesome to be here.
Well, Eleanor's case study today is really fun. I was telling her before we hit record because I have actually been on the other side as a speaker for one of her roundtables. And today we're going to dissect how roundtables, specifically hosting roundtables, has helped Eleanor add 2,655 subscribers to her list and generate $884,000 in sales. Yes, that is a huge number. Really excited about the data. Before we get into that, though, what's your Cubicle to CEO story?
Well, I started out as a journalist. So I've been a communicator my whole life, a professional interviewer, which is why I love roundtables so much. Started my career in advertising and public relations and found myself constantly writing. I was like freelancing for different, publications. And so I decided to go back to journalism school. And this was in the early 2000s. And I really wanted to be a news reporter. And so I was doing my internships. I was doing, news. I was covering everything from like car crashes and fires to elections and everything else. But this was around the time that the whole news industry and newsrooms themselves were sort of disintegrating. The model was dying. And so when I graduated from journalism school, there were no jobs in journalism. There were not any full-time jobs in journalism for me, but there were sort of freelancing jobs. And so I started doing a little bit of freelancing, but it always, like, I'm not a side hustle person. I am an all-in girl. And so I decided, okay, I see an opportunity, like I see the emergence of content creation. I see the strong need for communications consulting. I'm going to put my journalism experience together with my communications consulting, and I'm going to launch a communications consulting company. And so I launched that company, and that's really my sort of Cubicle to CEO story. That was my very first business.
It's interesting. You're going to be our 250 something interview, right? So obviously I've sat across from a lot of women and asked them their Cubicle to CEO stories at this point. It's so interesting, the recurring themes on our show. I've noticed the two most common unconventional Cubicle stories, or origin stories, if you will, have been people in our community who used to be actors or actresses and worked somewhere in the entertainment industry, or maybe as a dancer or performer, something of that nature. And then I think the second most frequent one is the media, news reporter, journalist kind of angle. And as someone who grew up wanting to be a journalist and still very much desires to be a TV personality someday, not so much in hard news, but more in that lifestyle conversational sort of interview format. It's just really interesting to see like the different skills and paths, especially anything in the creative realm that really lends itself well to business.
Well, I think there's an aspect to it, which is the ability to pitch something, so you have to be able to pitch either yourself, which is really key, or an idea. So for instance, when I was a freelance journalist or pitching, and I was doing that and, doing communications contracts, I would have to come up with a story idea, find the right editor for it, pitch it to that editor, do the follow up. So, what it is sort of amazing trial by fire sales training. You get really used to pitching yourself, which I sometimes lament today. I am a coach, and I think there's tremendous things in the coaching industry, but I feel sometimes there's a bit of a lack of resilience or a lack of what Marie Forleo would call like figure out ability in terms of just learning how do I take an idea, pitch it, and be relentless in developing a sales pipeline.
I love that. I feel like I might need to have you back on to talk just about that piece, or we can have a roundtable about it, right?
Yes, exactly.
Because I'm so on board with that. I totally agree. Pitching is one of the most underutilized and underrated skills, and that resilience in being able to accept rejection as not a finality, but rather, I guess, like an invitation to get creative is how I think about it. So powerful. All right, one more question for you that is unrelated to the case study. Before we get into the case study, I had to ask you this because you have advised everyone from multi-six-figure entrepreneurs, bootstrap, doing it themselves, all the way up to billion-dollar CEOs. So I'm very curious, what have you found is the biggest difference in terms of the problems that billion-dollar CEOs are thinking through versus your target market today, which, are primarily women making $200,000 or more? Like, what are the differences and the challenges that they're thinking through and working through?
I think it's one of timeline and scale. So let me give you a classic example. So one of my clients was a woman. She was $1 billion CEO. When the US president was trying to they put together sort of this consortium of women leaders to really help advise on things like what's going on in the economy, how do we promote, Canada US relations. Like, she was at that table in the White House. So amazing, amazing leader. And one of the big things that you see is a leader like that is thinking 10, 20 years down the road. And so, for example, she had exited one organization and was starting her next startup. And her customer research was taking a trip around the world, looking all around the world and asking herself, where are the big needs? And she was like, there's definitely huge needs around climate change. There's definitely huge needs around energy. And that's ultimately where she started her next business. And so, what struck me was the scope and timelines that they are looking at. And they're really looking at where are sizable opportunities and where will the needs be in 5, 10, 15 years versus the ones that I primarily work with today. As you're sort of scaling up from 200,000 to 2 million, you're still very much in eat what you kill mode, which is, you know what I mean? There's an immediacy. And I love that you asked this question because I do think there's such an opportunity for us as women to have some of these bigger conversations about scope, because a lot of times the size of your business will be determined by the industry you choose.
Totally. And to your point, this conversation is very timely because earlier this week, I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine who is one of those unicorns, has built a business that has been valued at $1 billion or above. And it was interesting when we were talking about media businesses and, my business and businesses like this in the online industry and how she comes from the world of enterprise business where everything needs to be, like you said, this giant problem with a giant need that can be scaled up to $1 billion. It is very rare, I think, for anyone in the industry that we tend to frequent more often, like online coaching, online education, to really have that same vision. It's not to say it's impossible, but I haven't yet seen it done. And so it's very interesting to think about that. Like, what's an enterprise vision or enterprise problem that you're solving versus like, here's a person I can help with my skill sets and knowledge. And like, what does that look like? So very interesting conversation. Thank you for entertaining me with that. I had to ask because, it's such a unique position for you to be in. Let's get into this case study because I know our listeners are dying to hear this. Okay, so a little background. You started hosting roundtables in Q4 of 2021. You have now done 14 total roundtables. Do you happen to remember what your first roundtable topic was about? And then more recently, what was your most recent roundtable about?
I sure do. So the very first roundtable I ever did was called How to Sell to Women. And so I had done like a podcast episode and I was really looking at selling to women. And I thought, there's some nuances here. And I know as a woman who buys things, there's some interesting nuances about how I buy, how I make decisions. A lot of our audience sells to women also. So I thought, let's come together and think about and have a conversation with people who also sell to women about some of their biggest insights in terms of selling to women decision makers, both B2B and B2C. So that was like a recent one. And oh my gosh, that was for the very first one. And then the most recent one, was it my anti-hustle manifesto? Or imposter syndrome. It might have been the imposter syndrome round. I'm forgetting, but it was bringing together folks to talk about the impact of imposter syndrome, on women entrepreneurs, how we lead, how we make decisions, et cetera.
Super interesting, super different topics. I love themed conversations, by the way. Like when I'm looking at events to attend, I really like super specific topics. Like when there's a panel, if someone's like having a panel on, general marketing, like that doesn't interest me nearly as much as what you were just describing. Like, let's really, really dig into this one specific layer of, of a topic of interest. So thank you for sharing that. I want to walk through the logistics of hosting a roundtable, just in case some of our listeners have either never attended one or never hosted one themselves or spoken at one. first question that comes to mind is, how many speakers do you generally include in your roundtable? And are you always playing the role of host facilitator, or have you ever kind of handed that baton off to someone else?
I've never handed off that role because I think that host facilitator role is a big part of what makes it magic. So as I'm doing a roundtable, I'm always looking at attendee numbers and are we keeping them to the bitter end? And we do. And that has a lot to do with the ability to host a conversation. We'll get into some of those details here in a minute, but I always play the role. And I would say the number of guests, you're going to sort of balance two things. So one is your experience at being able to facilitate a valuable, lively discussion between multiple people and being able to skillfully cut people off, bring people in, keep the conversation right, and creating rapport quickly. Especially if you have women as guests, we are very polite and we won't cut each other off, usually to the last 10 minutes of the conversation. And then we're
You're scrambling,
yeah. So we've had anywhere, I would never have less than three, fewer than three,
including yourself.
three plus myself. And I think that we've maxed out at six plus myself.
Great point, by the way. I love that you brought a layer of context into that because you are so right. And especially with your training as a reporter, it makes sense here. But moderators of panels, of roundtables, facilitators, hosts, whatever you want to call them, they make or break the conversation for sure. Like a skilled moderator can elevate the same panel of speakers to a totally different level of detail and engagement, all of those things that you mentioned. Since you did talk about cutting people off and that being a skill set that I'm sure many of us struggle with, myself included, what have you found is like the best way to, if someone's rambling or just like going off on a tangent that you can tell the audience is losing interest, how do you insert yourself without, I guess, rubbing your guests the wrong way?
Yeah. So I always pre-frame it and I always tell them both in the green room. So I tell them, look, my job is to really make sure this is valuable. And here's what that's going to look like. Sometimes I'm going to cut you off to bring somebody in. Sometimes I'm going to ask you for more detail. So I tell them there and really set that expectation. Then when we start the roundtable, I generally will set up my introduction to let people know that as well. Hey, we're coming together. We're going to have a really valuable conversation about that. We're going to cut each other off. We're going to interrupt each other. This is welcome here because we really want to have a lively, value-packed conversation. So I sort of set the tone and normalize. I will start to use body language. So I will start to, as the person is talking, and you usually don't want someone to talk for more than 2 minutes. More than 2 minutes, you're really stretching. And some people are just long-winded. So what I'll start to do is I'll start to sort of sit up in my chair a little bit and kind of lean in a little bit. I might start to be like, go like this, like put up my hand, like this is exciting. I just have to stop you there. And even if the point that they made like 1 second ago wasn't fascinating, I'll be like, I just have to stop you right there. Alan, this was a fascinating point and it makes me curious. And then I might like transition the conversation. So always trying to do it in a way that injects some energy. It doesn't make them feel bad that I cut them off, but also level sets at the beginning that this is what's going to happen because it is the audience. They're a core player.
Okay, love that. So jot that down, listeners. You want to get closer to the camera, literally take up more space on the screen. Use nonverbal cues to kind of indicate you might have something to add, like raising your hand or pointing a finger, affirm them, and then segue. Beautiful. Love that. And, I keep going back to your media background, but I do feel like it's important. And, when you first hopped into our green room for this interview, you were really kind in congratulating me on, the recent Mrs. Oregon and my whole pageant experience. And I will say one thing I have learned very recently because of the pageant experience is when I went on my little mini media tour, I had several television interviews and as a viewer, you notice how short segments are on TV, but it's even more apparent, I think, when you're actually there live. And most television interviews, guys, they're like 5 minutes, maybe 7 minutes maximum, sometimes even as short as 3 minutes. But you have to still get through quite a bit of content, quite a few questions, and just sitting there realizing, wow, it is possible to actually get a decent amount of information out in 20, 30-second sound bites is really fascinating coming from a long form content container like podcasting, where I can't imagine having a podcast conversation with you in only 5 minutes about this topic. And so I just think that's something that I want our listeners to take away is thinking through if you are part of a panel or a roundtable, thinking through how can you concisely get your message or answer out in that 2 minute or less time window. Like, be consciously thinking about that because it's going to make you a better guest speaker that a host wants to invite back. So thank you for giving us that time parameter, Eleanor. Super helpful. Okay. So we talked about speakers. We talked about, generally how you can help facilitate that. Do you change the themes or topics for your roundtables every single time? Do you ever have repeat themes or topics? Also, do you ever have repeat guests?
Yeah, I have definitely had repeat guests, and these repeat guests are repeat guests for a couple of different reasons. The first is that they are great partners, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, like this idea of building an ecosystem of partners. So they are great partners, and there's a ton of mutual benefits. Like, they really go to the wall in terms of supporting to promote this. And we want to really go to the wall in terms of supporting them and elevating them to our audience because I like them. That's like, yes, very strategic, but also I like them. I think they're fantastic and I want to expose them more. And usually that's because also they're very popular with our guests. They have like really interesting. So a couple of examples. One, of course, is Jordan from System
I
Save
love
Me.
Jordan.
You know what I
Yes.
mean? Everybody loves Jordan. Like, she's just fantastic. She's so real. She's so authentic. She's just fantastic. Chris Plackey from Leadership is Feminine is a fantastic, fantastic speaker and guest. And so they're excellent speakers. They bring a lot of value. They keep things lively, and they have been good speakers for specific topics that we've done. So generally with the topics, a big part of my sort of overall strategy and modus operandi is there was a movie that won, I think, the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. I think that was the Oscar. It's called Women Talking.
Oddly, I've never heard of that name, even though I'm like a religious watcher of the Oscar. So I must have just totally missed that.
I don't know that it was on the one on TV. It might have been on the untelevised, Anyway, what the movie was about is less important than this idea of women talking. It's how women get together. Like, it's the whole tend and befriend. So the way that we deal with stress with new situations is to get together and talk. And so, I'm a firm believer in women talking and then in conversations create. And so I choose different topics because if we think about sort of the marketing funnel, a roundtable is very much at the top of that funnel. And it's about how do I start to create, to center my brand inside or put them at the heart of conversations that I believe women who would want to work with us are having. And so it's very much sort of at the top of that funnel. And how do I do that? What are those conversations? And based on that conversation, who would be somebody that would have an interesting take on that? So, if you think about The View or like, shows where you have women talking and coming together to talk about stuff, that's kind of what I am looking for in terms of topics.
That's a really great comparison to use The View because, yeah, there is a diversity of personalities, of belief systems, of, between all of the co-hosts of that show, whether you agree with them or not. And so it makes it for an interesting conversation, like you said. Has there been a standout theme that in the past that was like the most well attended or the most engaged or whatever you want to qualify as like the best one?
100%. So the one that sticks out to me was roundtable that we did, which was called How Patriarchy Impacts Women in Business.
Ooh, already a hot button topic, already polarizing. I love that.
Totally. It was totally polarizing. And it was by far our most signed up for, most watched, most in demand roundtable, I think by a factor of 2. So it got double. And the speakers were dynamite. And so the speakers themselves were a little bit polarizing, had really thoughtful opinions on things. So it was a fabulous roundtable in terms of really, really bringing in people because, again, I think it's useful to think about what are some of the characteristics or what would maybe some of the viewpoints or some of the things that our ideal clients, what would they consider to be important? And I would say that in general, the vast majority of our clients would consider themselves to be feminists. Like, they would just straight up say, I'm a feminist, And so this is a topic that I think, how that sort of conditioning impacts us is a topic that's going to be interesting for many of them.
Good for you for knowing your audience on that level, right? And knowing what might really get them excited to show up to hear opinions about or perspectives about something that impacts them on a daily basis. I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned that one had such a high show up rate, a 2x factor, what is the average expectation for you around, registrations for a roundtable, and then what percentage typically do still show up live? I think a lot of people are wondering that because, in the age of COVID, in 2020, 2021, it's very hard to replicate those show up rates these days. So I'm just kind of curious what those stats look like in 2024 for you.
Yeah, so this is a great question. And so basically for a roundtable, you're typically going to have, or what we would typically have, and it's also going to depend on your speakers. And we can talk about that more as well. But you would generally have our roundtables would generally attract between 300 to say at max 1200. So 300 to 1200 is, and there's a big range there. And there's not a ton of predictability too about which topic or which speakers are going to draw the biggest audience. And so we're not sort of sure about that, but that's generally what it looks like. And so, between 300 and 1200. And to be very sort of open, like, we've never been the company that's had, when people are like, I had 5,000 people register for this webinar, or I had like 1,200 or 1,500, that's never been us. You know what I mean? It's just, I'm not saying that I'm not open to that, but that has never been us. We've generally been more niche. So that's kind of what we would see for registration. From a show up perspective, the minimum that we would want to see would be 40%. And so we would look at, 40 to 50% show up rate. And there's usually some email sequences. Like, I think that we'd normally do like a 3 email sequence, to get them to show up. And this is really important, especially if they don't know us. You know what I mean? And so they're coming in. And so there's that is in place. And yeah, I mean, there's no question that we're really feeling the sort of glut of content creators. And I say that with a lot of love and respect because I am one of them, you know what I mean? But the glut of post-COVID content creators that have come into the market, we're experiencing the impacts of high supply, which I think is where, that's why I'm saying, like, I think the quality of your topics, the quality of your speakers, like from my perspective, there's still tons of room, provided you're willing to be at the top.
Totally. And in a world of quantity, quality is what stands out, right? And I think, to your point, it seems like your meticulous attention to quality is not only in the room when the conversation is happening, but it's so much of the vetting process ahead of time. And that's something I, wanted to ask you about is, how do you invite speakers? How do you position it to them for them to see, this as an exciting opportunity? Do you offer them any incentives? On the flip side, do you require any promotion of them? Talk us through those logistics.
100%. This is a great question because I've done the summits. Like, I remember when I first started, now it's so funny, but back in the day, we used to do summits. They were like 3 days. There'd be 25 speakers. I can remember literally having like 2,000 people on my list and being like, you must have 10, because this is what I was just implementing a system, so, but it all worked out. So here's what I would say. For me, I think, and this is how I look at it, and I don't want this to intimidate anybody. I think this is an opportunity for everybody to own something. And I think you're a fantastic teacher on this. It's really about, hey, what's the value that you're bringing to the table? And being very clear about that and not pretending that you hosting something isn't a big deal and a big opportunity for people. So I think when I come in knowing that, and when I am willing to highlight and showcase, like, there's a reason that they're coming and I'm going to highlight and showcase that helps me with the positioning. So I think that's something that we can all do, and I'll do, some of us can do, pay more attention to that than others. So when you have the energy, oh my gosh, you'd just be doing me this big favor. That's like non-baller energy. And so I think don't bring amateur hour. Although if, bring amateur hour energy for your first few to get over yourself, do that too. That's all good.
I think, to your point though, I think there is a difference between humility and gratitude for people investing their time or energy into your community versus that, like, oh, I am not qualified to be asking you of this in the first place, right? It's a difference. There's a difference.
Yes. Amazing clarification. Totally. So the question was, how do I reach out and position it, right? So typically what I'll do is there's a vetting process first. And so the vetting process is, like, we did do a roundtable. There was a bit of a horror story where we did our vetting, but we overlooked this one thing. This is what we did, unless we did it when it was a brand partner roundtable. But I can tell you the horror story later. It's not that big of a horror story. It's not a big deal.
Well, actually, if you can neatly summarize it 30 seconds, I would love to hear, because I was going to ask you anyways, what is something that you've done in the past that was a big mistake that you would never repeat? Like, So if you want to use that as the example, then that's great.
100%. Yeah. I'll tell you, I've got so many horror stories, but well, mistakes, let's put it that way. So we had a roundtable with a brand partner, and one of the people on the roundtable is actually she's a fantastic entrepreneur. She's always been a fantastic partner to us. But somebody dug up this climate change denier, like it was a weird climate change denier post that they really took. And it wasn't like, the science is dubious. It wasn't even something that it was like something odd, you know? And if it had been me on my roundtable and it wasn't a brand partnership, I would have been like, but they had to really look for it. You basically would have really had to look for it. And so they went sort of 3 layers down. And we generally will go like 2 layers down. So when I think that would be, if you start to do these on a brand partner, it's like actually I would probably make sure that we're going 5 layers down, going like scrolling down through, you know what I mean? Really kind of taking a look at the history
Of their online presence, you mean like the content they post or share or engage with?
Yeah. So we vet our roundtable guests, and we normally do it in a couple of ways. Number one, is this person going to add value to our audience? Do they have articulated opinions? That's number one. Do I like them and respect what they do? And often I'm trying to look for a mix, like would they stand up to somebody if they didn't agree? Could we get some lively conversation going? So those are sort of the core things. Then I start to look at others. So with a roundtable, you want to have a good mix of people who you believe would be good partners. So we generally sign up for their email list. We make sure that they have an active email list, that they leverage it, that they use it. And those things help us understand that they're going to be a great partner, because the sort of business impact of a roundtable comes through email. It drives much more than social. Social's like fine for brand, but it doesn't really fulfill the sort of the list growth purposes of a roundtable. So those are the things that I am looking for in my guests. And we do sort of vet that. The requirements that we ask are always, number one, we'll ask for a solo email. We'll ask for like 2 social posts. And then sometimes if we really want the guest, and sometimes they're like, look, would you be willing to do this instead? Sometimes it's like, yeah, 100%. What's a big problem, and this does sometimes happen, is when people don't honor their commitments.
So what happens in a situation like that? Do you revoke their invitation? How do you handle that?
So we have what we call the velvet hammer in everything we do. And so we assume the best. And what that means is sometimes we're probably overwhelmed and forgot. It's always like people will respect what we inspect, And so we'll monitor and make sure that that promotion happened. And then if it didn't, we'll be like, hey, Sandra, we haven't seen it yet in your email. Just wanted to get a sense of when that's going to go out, And so we've never had somebody not fulfill. Actually, no, one time we did. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But we always sort of assume, we don't make a big deal about it. We don't make them evil. We're dealing with overwhelmed entrepreneurs. We get it. We've got you. We're not going to let you not be a good partner. So that's kind of what the requirements. And I will send a quick voice note typically first. Hey, Ellen, it's Eleanor. And what I'm saying, I'd love for you to be a part of this. This is who I am. This is who I've partnered with. And when we do these things, it's a fantastic opportunity to have a meaningful conversation, to highlight you to our community of highly vetted and we make everyone look even better. You know what I mean? Like we're going to have a conversation that you are going to be very proud of having. And here's what we ask. Just quickly let me know, are you in?
I really like that you refer to your speakers as partners in this collaboration, it really feels like, we're one team working to make this really successful. I do want to hear though, that one person that didn't follow through, period, even after reminders. What is the best step to take in a tricky situation like that? Like, do you allow it to slide? Do you revoke the invitation knowing that may permanently end your relationship with them? Like, what's your thought there?
So in this case, it was interesting. So this individual, fantastic individual, had great social presence. She committed to doing the things, and then last minute said she didn't really have an email list. And this was like the day of, because we're like, my friend, where is this? And so at that point, we were so far into it that I was like, okay, you know what I mean? This is going to create more problem than not. And so lesson learned, I will not partner with this person again. And that doesn't make them a bad person. Businesses, this stuff happens. If you've been in business long enough, and I've been an entrepreneur since 2003, you see all sides of people. And I no longer expect, it's just stuff happens. And so I could have gone back. I probably could have gone back and been like, you committed to doing this. You didn't do this. but it was more like water off a duck's back. And you are amazing. And that was not smart because you just lost a great partner. In my mind, that was in my library voice, my library indoor voice.
Right. There are always consequences to our actions, whether they are immediately seen or not. Right. So, great reminder for all of us. I feel like this is a perfect moment to insert your hot take. I talked to you before, coming on here, that I've noticed in the online space that there has been like rumblings of people feeling dissatisfied by what they would view as a one-sided collaboration. And one of the, topics of conversation have been around online summits, online roundtables, anything of that nature where there are other speakers involved, and people feeling like, hey, as a speaker, I'm being requested to do XYZ, but I don't get access to the list of email leads that the host does, even though I'm contributing to it. So, what are your thoughts around this? How would you respond to a concern like this?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a super legitimate concern if you look at it in a transactional way, which is that this is a one and done. You know what I mean? And I think that's so, yeah. So there's a couple of different ways to look at this. So the first is that I know, so I'll get really specific to us and then I'll just be a little bit more general. So I know from my perspective, when people come into my world, we have a community of buyers. So our community is very well vetted. These are very high level women. They invest in themselves. They buy a ton of books. They invest in programs and courses. You know what I mean? They share, they bring referrals. So they're in communities and organizations where they're going to talk about this. So if you come into our community and I highlight you in this way, that is more than an equal partnership. And if you don't feel that way, I understand, but I'm going to try my best to make sure that I share the value of that. So there's that part of it. But I do think the other aspect of it is that what I would love to see is that people see that they hit me back. And I always say that. And so it can be little things. Like I'll give an example. So you were a guest on my roundtable and I'm listening to you. I'm like, brilliant. And so then I hired you for a VIP day. I'm like, please tell me your secrets.
Which was so much fun brainstorming with you about brand
It was
partnerships.
so much
Yeah.
fun. And then I'm also like, I'm so inspired. I'm going to make a whole reel about Ellen Yin and like make it on my, and if you have stuff, I'm totally going to partner. So I do think there is, for me, it's like, okay, I always look at things like invite people to the table, make something exciting happen. So, bring something to something legitimate. And there's big investment in making that happen. So make sure that you get paid. But then it's like, make sure that everyone is whole. And so from that, it's like you're asking for something from this person. But in an ideal situation, you're partnering with like the partnership is two ways. And so, for instance, if they asked me, can you do this or this? Can you do this? 100% yes. But there's a bigger picture here, which I've always been one of my favorite newsletters is written by Elise Lunan. She has a podcast called Pulling the Thread. She was the chief content officer of Goop, ended up leaving that. And she writes about like feminist issues. And one of her newsletters talked about, she's like, men have no problem networking and helping themselves. So she was talking about how she was so surprised at the places where she didn't get support for her book. And she said, men can help each other without feeling like it costs them anything.
That's a very interesting perspective.
Right. And I was like, which is not to gaslight the people who are like, this is one-sided, because I think sometimes if, that absolutely can be the case. But it is like for everyone who talks about, so in my market, it would be women. For everyone in my world who talks about women elevating women, the real thing that elevates women is practical support, not just an ethos. It's about like, are we actually helping? So easier when you vet people and easier when you see them as partners and you see them as, okay, these are totally people I'm going to go to the wall for. And this could be a long-term partnership, not just a one-time thing.
Yeah. And I think that's the approach or perspective that I really want to pull out and highlight for our listeners, your explanation of how, yes, if you view it as like this is a one-time thing, then if there is no reciprocity in that moment, then yeah, you've technically lost out, right? But like kind of again, maybe on the speaker side, also looking at how are you vetting the opportunities you say yes to and the relationships with the people, I should say, that are offering you these opportunities. Do you see a long-term relationship with them? If the answer is yes, it may be worth depositing a few coins into that relationship bank, right? Knowing that at some point down the line, you may have an opportunity to withdraw that. And so I think the way that you explained that was really beautiful and really very kind, but also compelling argument to that internet hot take, if you will. So again, thank you for entertaining me on that. I did want to ask you though, since you mentioned that your audience is very highly qualified, a highly vetted group who are buyers, do you offer your speakers an opportunity to share a paid offer or perhaps an unpaid offer at the end of the roundtables for our listeners who are thinking about hosting their own roundtables? Anything else you might want to share about how you can attract the best speakers to these events?
Yeah. So I always sort of wrap up the event by saying, hey, where can people go to learn more about you? So it would be more like kind of like podcast interview style, where they will sort of highlight, will sort of link to wherever they want us to link. We'll put any links that they want to. So it's more of a, hey, here's where you can go versus that opportunity. Because normally there's not enough time to do that effectively, or it's kind of weird because we were talking about this and a lot of sales is about context. So, you know what I mean? So, yes, we 100%. And we don't put people right into sales sequences right after. I mean, I suppose a lot of internet marketers would be like, you're wasting an opportunity. But I'm like, they're not, they just met us like Jeeper. You know what I mean? Like, it's the likelihood of that. So yeah, so we always give people an opportunity and we'll be like, hey, where can people go to learn more about you? We hyperlink that out as we sort of send that as we do our follow-up, our post sort of follow-up, sending out the replay, et cetera. So that's typically what that looks like.
Okay, you just touched on the question I wanted to ask you next, rounding out the logistics for hosting a roundtable. So they do get the replay. Everyone gets the replay. And for attendees to get access to these roundtables, is it free to register or have you ever tried a paid roundtable?
No, we've never tried a paid roundtable, which is not to say that we wouldn't, but we've generally always had them be free.
And there's no limit in terms of time access to the replay, like they have it forever? Or is it like an urgency thing where it's like, hey, if you missed it live, you got to watch it within certain hours or else it disappears?
Yeah. So what we have generally done, we've experimented with both. So we've experimented with, hey, this is here. We've also experimented with, hey, it's going to be available for the next week, and so we have done both. And I wish I could say there's like a larger, well thought out strategy around that, but it's been more to experiment and just kind of see. But also there's this something about, it's very valuable. And I want to always make sure that people understand that there's value here. And part of that is, hey, it's not just available forever. Like, we're going to be reasonable. This is here. And also we might want to sort of package it up. We haven't really looked at selling them. We have not done that, but it's like, how can we package this up and maybe have it be critical conversations around blah, blah, blah. So we've just sort of done it to give ourselves some options, really.
I think you should definitely test that. Personally, I think that would be a great bundle to opt into for someone, or even turning it into a private podcast feed that someone can just listen to. So many of my favorite nuggets I've learned as an entrepreneur have not come from structured curriculum style courses, but rather just one-off little nuggets of wisdom that I happen to catch in a conversation, and it totally changes how I approach something or think about something. So a lot of value in that. And you mentioned that you don't immediately enter these new leads into some sort of sales sequence. So what is the desired next step or action item from, once someone has stayed through the end and they're, logging off this roundtable? What do you anticipate or want these leads to do? And how do you approach the sales process? Because like we referenced at the beginning of this conversation, you've generated $884,000 from these roundtables. So walk us through, like, where did this revenue come from? Like, what products and services were they buying? And also how are they coming to buy these things in the first place?
So the revenue is coming from coaching programs. So we sort of track who they are and where they came from so we can see. So that's where we see. So sometimes it's happening, and it would depend. I think the roundtables that are much more tactical and business focused, so they would be more, I would call it sort of mid funnel. You know what I mean? It's much more sort of a lead conversion type of topic. Those people who are signing up for those, they typically have the problem. And so they're, if it's a marketing focused roundtable example, we did one time, which was how to build effective women's communities. So we know that there are a lot of people that we work with who also work with a lot of women and are curious about, how do you build an actual effective community? And so we brought in people who'd build great communities. If you're building a great community, probably a sign that you are a builder. probably a sign that you want to coach. And so that would be an example of a roundtable that brought in quite a few customers and clients for us. So they are signing up for one of our, and in the last sort of, since we started doing roundtables, we've really had like 3 core programs that we've done. So that's like where they're coming in from.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, do you tailor which of the three you put in front of them first based on the topic of the roundtable?
No,
Okay. So is it always the same one that you pitch up front first?
no. So that would depend on what webinar that we were having coming up. The way that I sort of run things is I'm a very sort of a routine person. And so we would always have, we were like, every 2 months, we're going to have a webinar. And so our first goal after a roundtable is, because not everybody's going to stay. There's definitely going to be people who only signed up for that one thing. They have zero interest in anything else. And so they're going to jet. And, I would say that you're probably going to lose about 30% of your people.
And unsubscribes, you mean?
Yes, they're going to go away, within the next sort of 2-3 months. And that's fine because it's like part of vetting is that's part of it. You're not for them. That roundtable was for them, but you are not for them, or what you generally talk about is not for them. So there's that part of it. And so what we would do is we would just plug in these roundtables, and then they'd be on our list. We would generally have like an initial sort of level nurture, which is just any sort of, they would be in a classic nurture. Hey, this is who we are. Thanks for coming to the roundtable. Here's a little bit about us. Welcome. And then they're on the email list as part of like general population. And then the next sort of webinar that we did, they would have an opportunity to join that. We try to bring people in and then they are in our flow versus putting, bolting on more immediate, sales opportunities after that. And that is an opportunity. And I'm sure people could do that. What I will say is that gets back to this idea of conversations create. So we try to connect and reach out. Anytime somebody comes to our email list or comes to, our community through something that's new, generally a team member is going to try to connect with them on social media.
Oh, that's really cool. Like individually reach out to that person.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Love that high touch.
Oh, we're super high touch. Yeah. And again, conversations create. And, I don't know about you, but I want personalized, like the kind of advisory that we do. It would make sense. We're not like selling courses where it makes a lot of sense to have more automated because it's very, very specific. We're actually selling deeper business advisory. So those kinds of things, they have to kind of have a sense of connection. So we do a lot of, we call it hand-to-hand combat. Velvet hammer, hand-to-hand combat. People are like, wow, she's terrifying. This idea of like, we're going to be close to people. So we're going to actually reach out to them individually. They matter, and make that connection.
I love that. I think that's really what helps you stand out, especially in the age of automation, of AI, of ManyChat, of all the things that distance personalization. I think bringing that into the fold is one of those things that we talked about, that makes you bring the quality in a world of quantity. So to wrap up this case study then, Eleanor, I'm curious if you know any of the data around the leads, like the 2,600 some odd leads that have come through these roundtables. If you know any interesting stats about the subscriber quality, you already mentioned one, like 30% may, fall off in the first couple months. But do you know the average cycle? If you're having these live webinars every 2 months, let's say, what's the average cycle from when someone comes into your ecosystem, into your flow, and to when they actually convert to a customer? And do you know what percentage of the roundtable leads who have stayed on your email list have actually converted to paying clients?
That's a great question. I don't know what I do know is that generally the time to purchase is going to generally be between 3 and 9 months. You know what I mean? So it's generally in there. So some will be a little bit longer. Almost never do we have people buying right away. It's very rare, and that could be a function of the fact that we're not bolting on immediate sales funnels. But there is something around that. There is a little piece where it's like, it's all about context. And so if they've opted in for something, and the whole point, because it's very top of funnel, so we're having interesting conversations. For me, selling is about relevance. So the ability to make an informed decision around a sale. So sometimes there could be a roundtable topic that is not directly relevantly connected to whatever we're doing, and so in those cases, they may be waiting a little bit. And so it could be anywhere from 3 months to 9 months. That's sort of like, if they're going to buy, they're often in there. Some are a little bit longer, but yeah.
That's really helpful. And honestly, for your type of product suite or service suite, I mean, being higher ticket, that doesn't feel that long, right? 3 months is actually a relatively short time for someone who maybe doesn't know you to actually buy something that's a pretty substantial investment. So thank you. This has been very enlightening. I love getting to talk to you about this because I feel like you not only bring the logistical side, but you do bring in that extra layer of context that I so often crave, but not everyone offers up so willingly. So that was really, really refreshing. Thank you so much. Where can our listeners continue to connect with you, Eleanor?
Oh, I love it. So they can connect with me on social. So on Instagram or LinkedIn at Eleanor Beaton. And if you are a podcast listener, you can listen to the Woman Owned podcast.
Amazing. We will drop all of those links below for you listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in. Eleanor, thanks for being here. We'll catch you all in next week's episode.